Hey everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. I am so very excited to be talking to you guys about the new Sydney Grace palette. I need to hurry up and get this video filmed because I am running out of daylight lickety split. So I'm gonna try not to talk too much, but I must acknowledge the hat. I was wearing a hat all morning, and once that happens, you know, it's a choice for the day. So this is the new palette from Sydney Grace. Oh, and because I'm losing daylight so quickly, I am using my ring light, which I don't usually like to do that, but it was necessary today. But the Unveiled palette from Sydney Grace is in collaboration with Kendra, Matthies, who is a bridal makeup artist. I thought the way that she laid out this palette was very user-friendly. So as a bridal makeup artist, she gets a lot of the same requests. So she did her 3 most commonly asked for makeup looks in this palette: the kind of sultry pink row, the bronzy neutral row, and then the cool toned row. This palette is unique, I think, because it's so matte heavy. There's only 4 shimmers, 2 of which are actually more of a dark shimmer, so very different from what I would usually consider bridal makeup. But I am very interested to see how these go on. I have been doing a lot of swatching, and I am planning on doing a whole bunch of comparisons for you, because the number one thing I saw in comments about this palette was everyone's like, that is so pretty, but it looks just like all my other Sydney Grace palettes, because Sydney Grace does do a lot of pinks and neutrals and cool tones like this. So I want to swatch them against similar shades in the other palettes that I own. We'll see if we can find any dupes. And then at the end, I will do an eye look or 2. Just a couple more things I noted about this palette. It comes with a really nice matte white, which is actually not something I have in any of my other Sydney Grace palettes, which having a matte white was a really good choice since this is so matte heavy, and it does not include a champagne inner corner. It has this very bright sparkly pink up here. This is a different shade than usual for Sydney Grace because of how sparkly it is. Normally Sydney Grace's shimmers are very smooth. They have kind of that molten quality to them. This is like a really intense sparkly shade. So round 1 of swatches, I'm gonna swatch out this palette for you, and then we'll do some comparisons. Okay, so here we have the top row, which is all of the pinks. So very pretty usable colors. And there is that super sparkly pink. I have seen a few influencers do looks using this pink row, and it is a very beautiful color story. Okay, here we have the next 5 shades. This is like the center bronzy row. I simply must point out this shade. It is another sparkly shade. So it has a super rich chocolatey base, and then it's got gold sparkles throughout. So that is a super sultry color. A couple of these mattes that aren't swatching very well, don't let that deter you. Occasionally Sydney Grace mattes don't swatch well for me. I always get nervous, and then they actually apply beautifully. So don't let that scare you off. Moving on to the cool toned row. Okay, so here we have the cool toned row. Look at that nice pigmented white. That can make such a beautiful, oops, I just kicked my camera. A bright white like this can make such a beautiful inner corner. This is the type of shade I love to create looks with. Like, I mean, to me, that is an absolute stunner of a shade. I know it looks boring, but that's the one my eye immediately goes to. Look at this intense kind of pewter shade here. Sydney Grace does very well in making these kinds of shades. The fact that she chose to include a shade like that in this bridal palette, I think, is very interesting. It would make a very smoky look, very beautiful. So all in all, looking at those swatches, yes, most of this I will wear. I might struggle with these 2 shimmers just because I don't often wear dark shimmers, but I will try them. Okay, so now that we've swatched out the whole palette, let's do some comparisons. First up, let's talk about it in comparison to the Enduring Love palette. I almost call it the Everlasting Love. So this immediately was my first thought. They even have similar packaging. They're both beige with like a lace decoration on them. They're both beautiful. Okay, so here on top, we have the new Unveiled palette. Here is Enduring Love. So just looking at it, you may see a couple of shades that in the pan could be very similar to each other, but I can confirm that the browns you might think are dupes for each other are not. Like, I was just talking about this with a friend the other day, how it's incredible how many neutral brown shadows we can have in our collection, and they don't dupe each other. It's wild. I think it's very rare to have a brown that's exactly the same as another brown. So first up, let's compare the shade Honeymoon Phase with the shade Darcy. So here's Honeymoon Phase from the palette, from the Unveiled palette, and this is Darcy from Enduring Love. So you can see there's definitely some similarities there. The shade from the Unveiled is a little bit cooler. Now comparing the shade First Dance with the shade Cherish. Those are similar too. Let's do Bombshell Bride, the matte brown, with the shade Robert. Those are pretty different from each other. Let's do the shade I Do with the shade Passion. So that is much deeper. This is the shade It's Your Day from the Unveiled palette, and this is the shade Albert from the Enduring Love palette. So those two shades definitely have some similarities, but Albert flashes much more intense silver, and I feel that It's Your Day from the Unveiled palette does have a deeper base, but they are similar shades. Next up, let's do the shade Unity from the Unveiled palette and the shade Victoria. Those aren't close. Seems like Unity is deeper. Now let's compare the black shades. So the shade from Unveiled is called Not a Bridezilla. And in the Enduring Love, the black is called Boaz to each other. Not my most incredible job of swatching, but hopefully you can get the idea. I feel like the one in the Unveiled is deeper, a little bit more pigmented. So these are similar shades from the Enduring Love and the Unveiled palette. Okay, now let's compare the Enduring Love to the Tiny Marvels palette. There's not a lot of similarities between these. This is a much more colorful palette, but there are a couple of shades I want to swatch for you. From the Unveiled palette, we have the shade Blushing Bride and then the shade Flutterby from the Tiny Marvels palette. The shade Flutterby is peachier and lighter. Next up, Maid of Honor from the Unveiled palette, and then this is Bugaboo from the Tiny Marvels palette. So there's similarities there, but they're still not exactly the same, but they're decently close. The only other shades that might be close are the deep browns. So Bombshell Bride from Unveiled, which looks like this, and then the shade Spider from Tiny Marvels. So interestingly, Spider is more of a black brown. It's a much more cool brown than Bombshell Bride. So I would not call those dupes either. So some similarities here, but no true dupeable shades. Now let's compare Love's Journey, which is another one of their newer palettes. And this is another one with a lot of neutrals in it. So there's several shades I want to compare here. So here they are. Let's see if we can find any dupes. There actually aren't any pinks in this palette. So the first top row, there was no shades there I could even compare. Okay, I take that back. This first shade, Kisses, in the Love's Journey palette. They have so many palettes about love that I get all the names confused. But this first shade is a pink, but this is a more true Molten Formula pink, and it's not at all comparable to that sparkly pink in the new one. Let's compare the shade First Dance from the Unveiled. So here we have First Dance. Also the shade right next to it, Forever and Always, is fairly close. Let's compare this to this other shade as well. So these are both from the Unveiled palette. Let's compare that to the shade Everlasting Love. No, those aren't close. They might be in like the same intensity in terms of how you would use it on your eye, but the actual shades are quite different. Let's compare Happily Ever After from the Unveiled to Lovesick. Ooh, those are quite different. Still no dupes. Let's compare the deep browns. We have Bombshell Bride, which you've seen that swatched a couple times now. That was not a very good swatch, but you know the color by now. Let's swatch it with Mad Love. Some of these mattes are not wanting to swatch well because I think my finger is slightly damp and it's causing weirdness. Anyway, those are not close to each other at all. Now come two shades that I think are going to be very, very close to each other. The shades I Do and the shade Dreamboat. So first, I Do from the Unveiled palette, and then the shade Dreamboat from the Everlasting Love palette. They're pretty close to each other, but they're still not dupes. Interesting, but pretty close. Let's compare It's Your Day, that really intense dark shade, with the similar shade called Only You in the Love's Journey palette. Again, similarities. Sydney Grace does great making these types of shades. They're not exactly the same. The one from the Love's Journey palette is warmer than the one from the Unveiled palette. Okay, now let's compare the deepest shades again. So we have Not a Bridezilla from the Unveiled palette, and then Fools in Love from the Love's Journey palette. Again, the Bridezilla one seems to be a deeper black. So I hope that is helpful. I feel like the closest shades would be this one here. And I think that's really it. I think everything is different enough from each other that we don't really have dupes here. So I hope that is helpful. Let's do just a few more shades from some of the other palettes. Okay, let's compare a few shades from the California Coast palette, which it looks like there could be some similarities here. Let's check this out. Once again, let's take two shades from the Unveiled palette, First Dance and Forever and Always, just because one's just slightly deeper than the other. Here is First Dance and Forever and Always. Let's compare it to Laguna from California Coast. Yeah, the tones there are different as well. Laguna has more peachy pink in it. Let's compare the matte browns. So Bombshell Bride, again, the deep brown. And let's compare that with the shade Malibu. So I hope you can see the different tones of brown there. Isn't that interesting? Let's compare I Do, that beautiful taupey gray color, which I know compared to all the other shades, it's probably the most boring shade, but I love that shade. And let's compare that to Butterfly Beach from Laguna. Sorry, not Laguna, from California Coast. Oh wow, Butterfly Beach is much more purple, so not dupes either. Let's test the shade Unity from the Unveiled palette and compare it to that shade Malibu. Those two are actually closer to each other, so we might have a very similar shade there. Unity from the Unveiled palette, Malibu from California Coast, but they're still not exactly the same, but I would say those two shades are pretty similar. Now let's check the deepest shades against each other. So we have La Jolla Shores, which I always want to call that La Jolla. Every single time I gotta think about it. La Jolla Shores, and Not a Bridezilla, which again, that one is much deeper. So there we have comparisons between those two. Again, I hope that is helpful. Let's do one more, the Coffee Talk palette, another very, very neutral palette from Sydney Grace. I wish I could compare the Unbreakable Bond palette for you. That is one that I don't have from Sydney Grace. Here we have them on top of each other. Let's see if we can compare a few shades here. Let's compare the shade First Dance from the Unveiled palette to the shade Frappe. You can see Frappe is cooler toned. How about the deep browns? So we have Bombshell Bride again with the shade Java. Ooh, those are not at all the same. Yeah, Java is not nearly as deep. Let's check Unity with the shade Cold Brew. They're kind of similar taupey shades, but Unity is deeper. Let's compare Happily Ever After with Ristretto. So here is Happily Ever After, which is like a soft gold, and then Ristretto, much cooler. All right, let's check the matte blacks again. Trying to dry off my fingers. I keep wiping off my fingers and I get too excited and I don't completely dry them before swatching. Okay, should be good now. So the matte blacks, we have Not a Bridezilla and Espresso, which, yeah, not nearly as dark as the Not a Bridezilla shade. All right, so what do you think after all that swatching? I think there are a couple shades that are very similar to shades in other palettes, but I don't have any other palettes that are straight up dupes or even any other shades that are straight up dupes for each other. So that made me feel good. I really didn't want to buy a palette that was full of other shades I already had. It is unique in my Sydney Grace collection, which made me very happy. So I still have the original swatches on this arm. So like I mentioned before, I've seen people try out the pink row already. I saw Emily Noel do it, I saw Mandy Lee do it, and I saw people do the cool toned row as well. So what I think I'm gonna do is I'm going to try out the middle row, the brown kind of bronzy row, but on one eye I'm gonna keep it more soft and everyday, and on the other eye I'm gonna try and use this really intense sparkly chocolate shade. Let's bring you closer. Okay, let's do this eye first. Let's make this one the soft eye, and I have already laid down eyeshadow primer. So let's start with First Dance, and with this smaller brush I'm just going to very carefully kind of actually just kind of draw out where I want the shape of my eyeshadow to be. I realized I didn't take this off yet. Let's do it together. Aha! I was using the mirror like, whoa, this mirror really isn't very good. No, there's just plastic on it. All right, so now that I've got that laid down, I'm gonna blend that out a bit with a slightly bigger brush. I'm gonna pick up the slightly deeper shade next to it called Forever and Always with this flat brush, and I'm going to pat that on my outer corner. That is one of my favorite things that you can do with a Sydney Grace matte, is they respond so well to this kind of patting motion. And look, it looks blended. Oh, I just love that. Because I'm trying to keep this side more everyday, I'm actually not going to deepen it up any more than that. I'm going to take Happily Ever After on my finger, which I pretty much always use my finger with Sydney Grace shimmers. That is beautiful because it's not too gold. Ooh, that is lovely. Such a pretty shade. It's gonna blend out the edges a little bit more. And now I'm gonna take that matte white called Kenai Kisses and put that in the inner corner to brighten it. Oh yes, that is so nice. And then I'm just going to take a little bit more of First Dance and smudge that along my lower lash line. More just overall blending. It doesn't really need it, but gotta do it. I get paranoid of this one spot on my eye not being blended right there. And I'm just gonna throw on mascara. I'm just gonna throw on some Thrive mascara, which leave it to me to get mascara all the way out there on my cheek. All right, I think that's beautiful. Very easy everyday eye look. This side I'm going a bit more outside my comfort zone, but I am going to start the same way, taking that light shade and kind of sculpting out where I want the eye shape to be, and then blending it. Okay, so normally I would always use a shimmer with my fingers, but because I want control, I am going to use a brush to pick up this shade called Tie the Knot. That very beautiful, rich brown with sparkles. And I'm gonna put that on the outer part of my lid. See how like deep and rich that is. Wow. Do a little bit of blending with my finger there. All right, and I'm just gonna blend that a little bit using small circles because I don't want to bring that up too high. Okay, I'm getting a little bit more confident. I'm gonna take a little bit of that on my finger. We'll see if this goes out of control, but I just want to make sure the sparkles are really showing, which sometimes it can be harder to see that with a brush. Oh yeah, so you can see the gold sparkles much better now that I used my finger there. Now I'm gonna use Happily Ever After on the inner part of my lid and kind of pressing where they meet together right there. And then pressing with a finger that doesn't have any eyeshadow on it to try and merge them together. I think that's so pretty. I'm going to take Forever and Always on my lower lash line, but just on like the outer part of my lower lash line to connect it right there with the eyeshadow right there. If I don't do that, I always get like a weird gap right there. Now I'm just gonna blend the edges a little bit. Oh, my cat came to visit me. Hi, kitty. I noticed when putting that gold shade in my inner corner that I messily got some down here, so I'm just gonna add some more and finish that off. So Happily Ever After was that shade, and I'm just going to pull that into the inner corner and a tiny little bit right on the bottom lash line there. That just got a little bit too low from that initial time when I laid it down. I got a little crazy. I'm just gonna take a little bit of concealer. This is just the Glossier Stretch Concealer. I'm just going to clean that up a little bit. It's not quite so far down right there. And I'm going to use a little bit of brown eyeliner on my lower lash line. This is just from Wet n Wild, but I only keep it on like the outer third to really try and elongate my eye. Maybe a tiny bit more. Okay, I'm going to take, just kind of fixing things up a bit of Forever and Always, and put that right at the top where that shadow is mixing with that first shade that I laid down. I feel like I just need a little bit more depth right there to make that transition better. And again, with the small circles to try and keep it from getting too crazy here. There, it's getting a little bit better. Okay, throwing on some mascara. Okay, so here we have two different looks. One a lot more smoky and sultry. Ooh, it needs some more blending, I think, but moving on. And one that's a little bit more everyday. I thought I could move on, but I can't. I need to smooth that out a little bit. I have a feeling that when I'm going to use the top row, I'm going to probably dip into some of these other browns or even some of these cooler browns to tone down some of these shades. Like I feel like this peachy one here could be a little brighter than I would prefer to use, and I would just mix it with one of the browns. Anyway, I hope that this was helpful. I do like how intuitive and easy to use this palette is. None of this whole staring at a palette and figuring out how the colors should go together. This is how I would prefer it. Brands would just lay things out like this. Lay it out in looks or quads or trios or something so that it's not so confusing. Anyway, I think it's very pretty. I had a lot of fun swatching it out with you guys today and just comparing it to my other Sydney Grace palettes. Let me know if you have this one. Are you planning on getting this one? If you do have it, what do you think of the quality? I think it's beautiful. I still need to try that very, very sparkly pink shade that's just so different for Sydney Grace. But thank you guys for hanging in there with me. You can tell it's gotten darker as this video has continued. You know what I just realized? I was in such a hurry. I didn't make myself a cup of tea. Wow. I'm gonna go make myself one right now. If you're drinking a cup of tea, make sure to let me know down in the comments. I'm sorry I don't have a tea of the day for you today. Thank you for making it all the way to the end of the video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.